We're going to do a lot of Matthew. So Matthew, the whole chapter of 21, the first 14 verses of 22. And we're going to read it all throughout the morning. It does all the teaching for it. I don't have to do a lot of it. Matthew's done a bunch of it. It's all right there for us. I want to open our eyes to some things culturally and contextually that we miss. But it's all right there. We're going to cover a lot. I'm going to reference these Old Testament passages. I'm not going to have you turn to them. And so if you want to take a picture of that or write it down so you know where they've come from, or in your notes you want to write down where they're coming from, this is where we're going to go this morning. I'm going to add one. That's Galatians chapter 5. We're going to come back to that at the end of the sermon this morning. But that is the direction for us. It's a new series. We're going to continue through the book of Matthew. We're going to spend 5 weeks in this series. The month of February, we're going to take a month to talk about the church, the role of the church, who she is, as we celebrate 200 years. Then, Lord willing, from March until the first week of April, we're going to finish up the book of Matthew. We're going to land at the resurrection on Easter Sunday, which should be pretty cool for us to take that whole journey together. We're going to pick up the pace now. As you can see, we're covering 1 million verses this morning. We're going to cover a lot of it because I want you to see the narrative of it. I think sometimes we pick apart this too much, not too much, in ways that we teach differently, but I want us to see the whole scope of what's happening throughout this passage. It's quick, it's fast-paced, it's intense, and it feels like everything shifts in this moment in what's happening here in Jerusalem in Matthew chapter 21. So I've had the honor this year of doing a number of weddings, which I enjoy doing. It seems like I get the weddings and Daryl gets the funerals. That's how it works for us on staff, which I'm fine with that, totally fine with it. But doing a lot of weddings, and so kind of the new thing has become the first look. You guys know what I mean? Where the groom gets to see the bride before the wedding. Anybody do that at your wedding? You saw your bride before the wedding? Heretics, all of you. It's ridiculous that you did that. One of my favorite moments of these weddings is when the doors open. Well, who am I kidding? We're outdoors now for all the weddings. So when the trees part at these farms that everybody, Pinterest tells you to get married at a farm, and so you do it, ladies. It's what Pinterest said to do, and so yes, Pinterest, whatever you want me to do. And so, but when that happens, and there's this moment, right? And if the groom hasn't seen the bride yet, it's even better. But if he's already seen her, that's a great moment too. I'm just not there for that. I love this moment. So there's this moment where the music changes and the mother of the bride stands up, right? And then everybody stands and all eyes are fixed on this beautiful, beaming bride. She has spent all day. She and her friends got up at 3 a.m. to get their makeup on and get their hair done. And the wedding's at 8 p.m, but they spent all day getting ready for it. They took 300 pictures before. They got 500 between the wedding and the reception just for us to sit around and wait for them, because that's what I came to do. I came to wait for 2 hours for you to get your pictures done before you feed me. But they've done all that, and so that day has lingered on, right? And you've driven 2 hours to get to this beautiful farmland that apparently we don't have in Ola, so you got to go somewhere else. And so you go there. I'm venting. I'm sorry. This is personal, and I'm very sorry. And there's this moment where the doors of the chapel, the doors of the barn, it opens. And like everything stops. You know that moment? And you see this bride. And one of my favorite things is to watch the groom in that moment. How he just falls to pieces. He just smiles. And I remind him in the wedding and during premarital counseling, she'll never look that good again. Like that, take it in. Take all that in. She knows it, you know it. She spent all day getting ready. She'll never spend all day getting ready again. It'll never happen. She gets more beautiful, but it doesn't take as much time. Anyway, that happens. He falls to pieces, and the eyes of everyone in the crowd are on that woman, on that girl. And you just watch step by step as she comes down to Back in Black, and she comes walking down to whatever she's walking down to. And she gets to the front, and there's this moment where symbolically, I'm pretty staunch about this. Symbolically, I like the bride on my right, your left, the father, whoever's giving her away, then the groom, because the picture is at this point, daddy's still in the way, right? The father of the bride is still in the way of what's about to happen. And so then the question is, who gives this woman to this man? Everyone's still standing, fixated on what's about to happen. And I asked the father to literally join their hands or join their arms. I want him to be the one that says, I affirm this. This is okay. I'm blessing this union. And then they come forward. And from that point forward, your eyes are on her and then him a little bit, but mostly her for the rest of the night. That's what's happening, right? And so the beauty for me over the past year, these weddings, there haven't been a whole lot of bridezillas, so they've been okay. They've been kind of quiet and calm. But even the most humble, down-to-earth girl she changes in that moment when every eye is on her. As shy as she might have been beforehand, she loves it. Gosh, she loves it. And she should, like this is her day. But something shifts in that where everything changes from that point forward. All eyes are on her. It happens at the reception. You'll see them the next week at church, and you're like, oh, you were so beautiful. Everything shifts and changes there. So with that in mind, that's what's happening here in Matthew 21. So as Jesus makes his way to Jerusalem, he's said a lot of things. He's healed a lot of people. And the statement he gives them is, hey, don't tell anyone about this. Don't tell anyone until it's time. Well, now it's time. And the doors of the chapel, the doors of the barn, the doors of the farmhouse have all flung open. And now we see him for who he is. And some people like it, and some don't, but all eyes are on Jesus. Before I continue any further, first through fifth graders, Carly and Dana, you guys have baskets. First through fifth graders, coming up and get your activity bag, your worship bag. There's notes in there, crayons, maybe some candy. I don't know what's in there, but you can come grab it. First through fifth graders, come on up. Your middle school brother also needs you to get one for him as well. So all this is happening here in Matthew 21. So if you grab your Bibles and go to Matthew 21, we're going to start at verse 1. We're going to take the journey all the way through. But we're going to move quickly because I want you to see a few things that are happening here. And the context is crucial for us to really, really get it. We're calling this series Unleashed because Jesus has been unleashed. It's all bets are off, the gloves are off, no holds barred. All of it is happening right now. And over the next 6 or 7 days of his life, everything has culminated to this moment. So here's Matthew chapter 21, verse 1. Now when this is Jesus and his disciples, drew near to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the center of worship for the Jewish faith. It's where the temple is, which is built off of the tabernacle. Everything happens in Jerusalem. The high priest is there. They make their way to Jerusalem, and they came to, we read that Bethphage, however you want to read it. In Hebrew, the word is Bethphage, and here's why that's important. Bethphage, Bet means house of. This means house of the early or unripe fig, and that's important for us. I'm telling you that because it's important, not just for you to know. I want you to understand this is important for us. This region is known for their fig trees. And so you got Bethphage, but you also have Bethany or Bethany. Bethany is the house of the fig. Bethphage is the house of the unripe or the early, the young fig. This region in particular, 2 miles away from Bethany, is known for developing its figs early. The fruit comes early in Bethphage. So it's how their commerce works. They're waiting for this season. And so the fig trees would develop a certain kind of leaf that would let you know it's time. And that all happens here. Matthew's letting us know, here's where they came to. They came to the house of the young, the early fig. And from there, they go to the Mount of Olives. Now, the Mount of Olives is on your way from Bethany or Bethphage all the way into Jerusalem. And you got the Mount of Olives. It's kind of on a hill, and it overlooks the city of Jerusalem. Now, from there, you would descend down the Mount of Olives, and you'd get into the Garden of Gethsemane down at the bottom, kind of the valley. And from the valley, you make your way back up to the Temple Mount or the city of Jerusalem. And so Jesus has led them, and they're making their way towards Jerusalem, and they stop at the Mount of Olives, and Jesus shows them what's happening. And he says, now, he sends 2 disciples. It's going to sound like a Jason Bourne movie, and it kind of is. He sends them, he says, go to the village in front of you, this tiny village of Bethphage. Go to the small village in front of you, 1 stoplight kind of town. Go to this village. Immediately, you're going to find a donkey. It will be tied and a colt, a young horse with her. Untie them and bring them to me. Now, if I'm a disciple, I've got a lot of questions at this point. Do you have questions? Do they know I'm coming for their donkey and colt? Have you talked to someone ahead of time? If I go there, will their ring cam pick me up? How will they talk about me on Ola Talks? How do I know if I'm doing this? He says, go. Untie them, bring them to me. Then look at verse 3. If anyone says anything to you, other translations say it more like when someone asks you, give them this phrase, give them the code word. The Lord needs them. Which I'm going to try that at lunch today. I'm going to try that. The Lord needs these chicken fingers. And he will send them at once. Then verse 4, this took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. This is Zechariah 9, saying, say to the daughter of Zion, Zion is the name that the Old Testament prophets gave to Jerusalem. Say to the daughter of Jerusalem, Behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden. And the disciples went and did exactly as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt. They put on the animals, their cloaks. Jesus sat on their cloaks that were on the donkey. And most of the crowd spread their cloaks on the road. Others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. What do we call this day in Christian tradition? Palm Sunday. This is Palm Sunday. They're laying palm fronds down. In verse 9, the crowds that went before him and those that followed him were shouting, Hosanna, which means God save us or save us, to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. So I want to stop here just to give us some understanding. Jesus has arranged every detail of what's happening right now. This has all been intentional, beginning with the timing of it. This in the Jewish calendar is leading us into the Feast of Unleavened Bread, where they will celebrate Passover, which is all built on, remember our study in Exodus, all the way back to their journey, the Israelites' journey being set free from slavery in Egypt through the Passover lamb. They have a meal every year. And every year, Jews make the pilgrimage from all over the Middle East back to Jerusalem for this very thing. So scholars, archaeologists tell us at this time, Jerusalem was probably 50,000 people in population, 50,000 people. This week, every year, another 150,000 people descend upon Jerusalem. So if you were in Henry County in the early 2000s, you know exactly what this was like. You get it completely. For us in Ola right now, does it feel this way? Like it's a small town and now it's about to be New York City because there's so many houses going up. You feel like it's happening. So the population quadruples in a week's time in Jerusalem. And they've all descended to celebrate this. So on a typical Sunday here, we'll have, let's say, 450 people or so. Can you imagine trying to fit 2,000 people in this room? That's what it's like. Think of the feelings you would have when someone takes your seat. Anybody try to drive last week in Henry County? Did you try to drive at all the week before Christmas or the weekend before Christmas? Did you get very far? While maintaining your Christianity, did you get very far keeping your testimony? Try to take I-75. That's what's happening. It's chaos. There's emotions everywhere. There's some who are coming because it's what you're supposed to do. Some are looking forward to it. Some have planned all year for this. Some it's snuck up on them. Some of them, they're just coming because their wife said they have to every year. And so that's what's happening. You've got a caravan of donkeys and mules and horses and camels, and they're carrying families from all over. And so this road, Jesus and the disciples aren't the only ones on the road. There's thousands of people, tens of thousands of people. There's no hotels. People have put up campsites along the road. And so when that's happening, all sorts of things are happening. And so it's scary for some. It's dangerous. Some are looking forward to it. It's just a chaotic time. And this is when Jesus has decided to make his entrance into Jerusalem. He also chose to ride in on a donkey. And we read that because we know the story, and we've already did our nativity calendars, and we've seen Joseph on a donkey. It's fine, we believe it, but there's a whole setup of what's happening here. You know, Jesus is not the first king of Israel to ride a donkey. In fact, he's not the first king of Israel to ride a donkey on this road from the Mount of Olives to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Back in 2 Samuel chapter 16, King David, after he is restored to his office as king, rides a donkey from the Mount of Olives down to the Garden of Gethsemane and back up to the Temple Mount. A number of years later, the son of David, Solomon, would ride that same donkey from the Mount of Olives through the Garden of Gethsemane and all the way back up the Temple Mount. Jesus knows what he's doing. He's arranged there to be a donkey that he will ride in the lineage of King David and the son of David, King Solomon. And Jesus will now be another son of David riding the mule or the donkey from the Mount of Olives through the Garden of Gethsemane and all the way back up to the Temple Mount. So all this is happening, and then you've got these crowds of people. And these are pilgrims who have traveled, those who have followed Jesus. And all the way back to the Sermon on the Mount, the people who are following Jesus are not the people you want your kids hanging out with. They're not. They are tax collectors and prostitutes. They're strippers and drug addicts. All of them are now following Jesus. And now they're journeying together. And Jesus now is on a donkey, and these people, all they have is their cloaks and branches. And so they start making a red carpet for the king. And they lay it down, and they're crying out, Hosanna, save us. Save us. You're here. It's happening. They see the writing on the wall. They have expectations for what's about to happen, and Jesus too. But they're crying out. These people believe Jesus is the real deal. He is who he says that he is. And they're ready for it. I want you to picture the scene of what's happening. And so they make their walk down. You can see them from the temple. You can see the Mount of Olives. And you see all these people down through the Garden of Gethsemane and all the way back up. And they enter Jerusalem in verse 10. When they entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, who is this? Now this phrase, stirred up, it's probably better translated agitated or tormented. Think about when you go to the store and you bring back 2 liter of Coke or 20-ounce bottle of Coke, and then you carry it into the house and you're so thirsty you open it, and it goes everywhere because it's been agitated. That's what Jerusalem is, a Coke bottle right now. That's what's happening. Everything is spewing everywhere. Jesus, remember, for 3.5 years it says, don't tell anyone who I am. But now he's like, tell everyone. In fact, I'm going to tell them who I am. So Jesus causes this scene, making his way down. Jerusalem will never be the same. They're asking, who is this? And the crowd say, you know who this is? This is the prophet Jesus, the one from Nazareth of Galilee. And the expectation is, here we go. Rome better look out because the king is here. So just beyond the temple is the throne room, essentially, of where Caesar would be. The Roman governor, he would be there. And so they can't wait until they walk up or down the valley, up through the temple, around the temple, and they march right into Caesar's office. And they start demanding things of Caesar, and Jesus starts tearing down Rome. The king is here. There's no king but Jesus. They can't wait for him to say it. But I want you to see what Jesus does in verse 12. Jesus, though, enters the temple. So like the bride who opens the door, and all eyes are on her, all eyes are on Jesus. The followers are with him in front and behind. You've got people watching from the temple gates, from the walls, watching this happen. They're trying to make sense of all of it. They see the helicopters, they hear the sirens, all of it. And so they're ready, and instead of going around the temple, Jesus goes right towards the temple. And he comes inside. And immediately he drives out all those who were selling and buying in the temple. He overturns tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And you're like, yeah, that's the Jesus I'm talking about. That's the one right there. Let me show you a picture. Here's a picture here of the temple, just so we have an understanding of what's happening. So Jesus is marching down. He'll come up. In the middle there, that is actually the temple. The other walls give us a courtyard. If you remember from our Exodus study, it models the tabernacle. So in the courtyard, everyone's invited. Gentiles can be there. Jews can be there. But inside that narrower area, the holy places where only Jews are invited, it's where they would offer sacrifices, where priests would be cleansed. And then the taller building is the most holy place, the Holy of Holies. That's where the atonement sacrifice is offered. All that happens in there. Now, to the left with the red roof, that's called Solomon's porch or Solomon's portico. That's where all this is happening. We're going to read about all this is happening in Solomon's portico. There's a high priest now whose name is Caiaphas, and there used to be in Jerusalem money changers. Anytime you go overseas, you have to exchange your American dollars for euros or pesos or whatever. That same thing's happening in Jerusalem. But Caiaphas recognized, hey, all these people are coming around this time. What if we moved the exchange booths from outside the courtyard into the temple courts? What if we moved it in? So Caiaphas recognized if we did that, we set the rate, we can make some money. We can help fund whatever projects that we have, or I need a new plane, so we can do it that way. And so he builds this whole system. And around this time, what's happening is people are traveling from miles and miles and miles away, and they're coming to Jerusalem for Passover. And at Passover, you offer a sacrifice. And so the marketing campaign is, hey, don't travel with your lamb. Buy a new one. Just buy a lamb here. It's grass-fed, organic, and farm-raised. You're going to love this one. And so they've got signs everywhere, billboards on the way as you're walking down. And so what they're doing here in Solomon's porch is they're selling sacrificial animals to you. And they're selling them. You exchange your money, you get taken advantage of there, and then instead of bringing your own, you're going to buy a sacrifice there, which means you didn't come with one, which means you're desperate for one, which means they can really upcharge how much you need to pay for this sacrificial animal. Does that make sense? That's all happening inside the temple gates. Where the prophet Isaiah said, no, the temple is the place where heaven and earth meet. It's where God and man meet. It's this sacred place. But Caiaphas has turned it into something else. So Jesus steps in. He starts flipping over tables. We learn in Mark that he makes a whip and starts whipping people. It's just chaos. Chaos again. This quiet, humble Jesus of, hey, don't tell anybody, is now like, I'm telling everyone. And then we continue reading in verse 13. Jesus says to them, it's written that my house shall be called a house of prayer. That's Isaiah 56. But you've made it a den of robbers. That's Jeremiah chapter 7. But I want you to pay attention to where Jesus goes. Braxton, can we go back up to the previous verse? Jesus goes to the seats of those who sold pigeons. And you Sesame Street fans are like, yeah, Bert and Ernie, they love them some pigeons. So I understand what's happening. So pigeons, if you haven't really read Leviticus, you're not quite sure what's happening. Some of your translations might say doves instead of pigeons, which I don't know how you confuse the two, but pigeons. So here's what's happening. There's different levels and costs of sacrificial animals. In Leviticus, God made a concession for the poor. So I know lambs are expensive, so I will accept a sacrifice of a pigeon or a turtle dove, a dove. I'll accept that sacrifice in place of a lamb if you can't afford it. So up in Solomon's porch, this whole system is set up, and Jesus goes right for the pigeon sellers. Because of all the people being taken advantage of, it's the poor who are being taken advantage of the most. They couldn't afford it back in their town. They can barely afford to travel here. And so the last coins that they have, they're spending on a sacrifice. And those selling the pigeons are like, yeah, we know how desperate you are. So if you don't have enough money, then we'll just hold you in debt servitude. So Jesus makes his way to those people. This whole system is jacked up, man. It's been set up to take advantage of the poor and to elevate the wealthy. And if that sounds familiar to you, then we're on the same page. So Jesus goes to them, makes this statement, and then verse 14, while he's berating the leaders, the blind and the lame come to him in the temple. And why are they coming to him? Because they're the ones buying the pigeons. The blind and the lame can't work. They don't have money. They're right there around him. They come to him in the temple, and Jesus heals them. A far cry from, I'll heal you in the wilderness, don't tell anybody. He's in the temple, healing them. But when the chief priests and the scribes, now watch the language Matthew uses, it's beautiful, saw the wonderful things. When they saw the wonderful things he was doing, he's healing, the children cried out, and not like in anger, but they're excitingly crying out, Hosanna, Hosanna to the Son of David. While wonderful things are happening, people are being healed, children are joyfully proclaiming who he is, the leaders are indignant. Beautiful worship is happening, but those who run the place of worship don't like what's happening. Does that sound familiar? When we continue, the leaders say to Jesus, do you hear what they're saying? And Jesus says, yeah. But have you not read your own scriptures? And I love that he's saying it to scribes, Bible scholars. Oh, maybe you passed this. You looked over this part. Out of the mouth of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise. And then Jesus leaves. Leaving them, he went out of the city to Bethany, the house of the fig. It's important. And he lodged there. Then Matthew tells us the next day, verse 18, in the morning as Jesus was returning to the city of Jerusalem, he became hungry, like you do. When you're traveling, he wants some combos and a cherry Coke on his way. Verse 19, and seeing a fig tree by the wayside. So between the house of the fig and the house of the young, early ripe fig, Jesus gets hungry. And he finds a fig tree, but he goes to it and finds nothing on it but only leaves. And he said to it, may no fruit ever come from you again. Which feels like an overreaction, doesn't it? What did that tree do to you? There are other trees. It feels like it, but this is brilliant what Jesus is doing. And the fig tree withered at once. The disciples saw it, verse 20, and they marveled, saying, how, what, how, why? What just happened? And Jesus answered and said to them, truly I say to you, if you have faith, if you don't doubt, you will not only do what has been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown to the sea, it will happen. And whatever you ask in prayer, you will receive, if you have faith. And when they entered the temple again, Jesus goes back to the scene of the crime. He goes back to the temple. The chief priests and the elders of the people came up to him as he was teaching. And they said, hey, by what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you the authority to stand here and teach? Who gave you authority to heal in our temple, to flip over tables? And Jesus says, hey, I'll answer your question with another question. And if you can answer my question, then I will tell you by what authority I do these things. So the baptism of John, Jesus says, John the baptizer, from where did it come? Was that from heaven? Did God ordain him to do it? Or is that all his idea? Did it come from man? And they discussed it among themselves. So now they get in a huddle, like, how are we going to answer this? They said, the problem is, if we say it's from heaven, then he's going to say, then why didn't you believe him? But on the flip side, if we say it's from man, the crowd's going to be after us because they hold John as a prophet. And so the best response they have to Jesus is, And then Jesus says, well, then a deal's a deal. Well, then I'm not going to tell you by what authority I do these things. And if you think Jesus stops right there, then you don't know who Jesus is. Like, he's just going to keep going. So Jesus now is going to give them 3 parables, and they're all going to stack on top of each other, and they're going to all say the same thing in different ways. So he begins, parable number 1. What do you think, chief priests and elders? He's in the temple speaking to the leaders of the Jewish religion. What do you guys think? Let's say a man has 2 sons. And so he goes to the first son, and he says, son, I want you to go out and work in the vineyard today. And the son answers, not going to do it. But afterward, he changed his mind, and he goes out to work. Well, then the man goes to the other son, and he says the same. And the son says, yeah, definitely, I'm down. No cap, I'm going. I don't know what that means. I heard kids say at camp. But did not go. But he didn't go. He says, I will, but he doesn't go. Then verse 31, okay, scribes, Pharisees, chief priests, which one did the will of the Father? Well, obviously the first one, the one who actually went. And Jesus said to them, So I'm telling you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes, the grievous of sinners, will go into the kingdom of God before you. Because John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you didn't believe him. But the tax collectors and the prostitutes believed him. And even when you saw it, you did not afterward change your minds and believe him. So he's saying, I want you to understand, the tax collectors and the prostitutes, the sinners, they're like the first son. They didn't want anything to do with it at first, but then changed their mind, and then they did what the Father had asked them to do. But you Jewish leaders, you're like the second son. You said you would. You agreed to the covenant. But then when I finally came, you wouldn't do anything about it. And again, Jesus, he's not stopping. He continues. Let me tell you another parable, he says in verse 33. There was a master of a house who planted a vineyard. And why all the vineyard talk? Because he's got vineyards right there on the mountain, and he's looking at them. And he put a fence around it. He digs a wine press in it. He builds a tower and leases it out to tenants. And then he goes away to another country. And so the season for fruit drew near. He sent his servants to get the tenants to get his fruit. But instead, the tenants took his servants, and they beat one, killed another, and stoned another, which is exactly what happened to some prophets. And he sent other servants, more than the first, and they did the same thing to them. So finally, the king sent his son, saying, surely they'll respect my son. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, oh, this is him. This is the heir. Let's kill him, and then we can have his inheritance. They took him, they threw him out of the vineyard, and they killed him. When therefore the owner of the vineyard comes, what do you think he's going to do to these tenants? And quick to respond, the Pharisees, scribes, the elders said, oh, he's going to put those wretches to a miserable death and let out the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the fruits in their seasons. And Jesus said, yeah, haven't you read this before in your scriptures? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing. It's marvelous in his eyes. Therefore, I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and will be given to a people producing its fruits. And the one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him." And when the chief priests and Pharisees heard this parable, they perceived that he was speaking about them. Oh, you think so? Brilliant. Yeah, you think he's talking about you? And although they were seeking to arrest him, they were feared the crowds because they held him to be a prophet. And then Jesus continues. "And again, Jesus spoke to them in parables with a third parable, saying, 'The kingdom of heaven,'" we've heard that before, haven't we? "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. He sent his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding feast, but they would not come. So he sent other servants, saying, 'Tell those who are invited, look, I've made dinner. I've used my oxen and my fat calves. They've been slaughtered. Everything is ready. Come to my wedding feast.' But they paid no attention and went off, one to his farm, another to his business. And while the rest seized his servants, treated them shamefully, and killed them. So the king was angry, and he sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. And he said to the servants, 'The wedding feast is ready, but those invited were not worthy. So now go invite anyone you can find. Go to the main roads. That's where the poor and the lame and the beggar, that's where they are. And invite them to the wedding feast. Invite as many as you can find.' The servants went out to the roads, gathered all they found, both bad and good," which takes us back to other parables. "And so the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to look at the guests, he saw a man there who had no wedding garment. And he said to him, 'Friend, how'd you get in here? How did you get in here without a wedding garment?' The man was speechless. And so the king said to the attendants, 'Bind this one, hand and foot, and cast him into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth,'" which is a Jewish euphemism for a place called Gehenna, which was the place of the grave where they would burn bodies. Then verse 14. "For many are called, but few are chosen." So Jesus has given them three parables. In each and every one, the religious leaders are on the bad side of it. They aren't the hero. They aren't the good son. They aren't the good servant or the good tenants. That's not who they are. They're the ones who were given opportunity, and they squandered it, and therefore they've lost any authority at all. And then Jesus tells this final one. So contextually, we need to learn a few things culturally about a wedding in this day. So the wedding would happen to be a long betrothal, a long engagement, and then the wedding would happen. There'd be a big feast that would happen. And so all the guests would get dressed for the wedding, and they would come for the wedding feast, and they would put on whatever they had. And so what happens when that happens is that you are able to tell different classes of people. It happens at weddings that you go to today, isn't it? You can tell the wealthy ones, they've had their suit dry cleaned and ironed. They actually have a suit or multiple of them. They've got those on. They've got the shiny shoes. They're coming to a farm, but they're wearing a three-piece suit for the farm wedding, and so they've come to it. And then the rest of us are putting on our Dockers and collared shirt that we just ironed in the dryer, and we put that on. And so now we're coming in our cowboy boots and Wranglers and coming. And so there's a difference. And same thing is happening here. The wealthy, they like you to know that they're wealthy. And so they're wearing the best clothes, they've got on the jewelry, the whole thing. But the point of the wedding isn't the guest, the point of the wedding is the bride. And so the way they would counteract that was when you threw a wedding and had the feast, people would come into your house or come to wherever you're having the wedding, and the person throwing the wedding would give you a wedding garment, a plain linen robe to put over whatever you're wearing, so that you aren't taking the attention away from the bride and what's happening. You would cover up whatever you thought was valuable, whatever worth you were bringing to the table has been covered up by what the king or the master of the wedding has given to you. So what the story Jesus is telling is there was someone who refused the garment from the king and instead was satisfied with their own garments. Throughout Scripture, particularly in the New Testament, but it starts back in Genesis chapter 3. Adam and Eve find themselves in sin, and they run to cover themselves. And what do they use? Fig leaves. And God meets them and says, it's not going to work. And so God sheds the blood of an animal, and the shed blood of an animal, the animal's skins now are the covering for the sin because the fig leaves would not work. The fig leaves weren't indicating what was actually happening. And so throughout the Old Testament and then into the New Testament, here's what we learn, is that our righteousness, whatever we think we're clothing ourselves with to gain salvation, to get into the wedding feast, isn't going to cut it. What we need is we need the righteousness of Jesus to cover whatever righteousness or lack of righteousness that we have. Even our best won't get us into the wedding feast. So Jesus, instead of going to Caesar, stops at the temple, and he finishes with this parable as if to say, you're trying to prove yourself, and you're going to find yourself where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. I've given you every chance. You said no, you kept saying no, and so now I've invited the Gentiles. I've invited everyone. I've invited the lame and the crippled. I've invited the poor and the prostitute. I've invited the stripper and the drug addict. But you think that your righteousness is going to get you in, and I'm telling you that unless you put on the wedding garment, the righteousness of the Son, you will not be accepted into the wedding feast. But the religious leaders can't figure it out. They think they've earned something. I want you to pay attention to what Jesus is doing, where he goes and what he says, both with his mouth and with his actions. The expectation is that the problem is Rome. Rome is the oppressor. And if we can get rid of Rome, finally we'll have everything back. So the belief for the Jews in the Old Testament, and even today, is that Jesus, the Messiah, will overthrow any kind of governmental authority and will finally reunite all the Jewish people. So they're waiting. It's like, this is the day. We're going straight to Caesar. But Jesus never makes it to Caesar. He stops at the temple. And it's not quiet. It's not subtle. It's over the top. And he doesn't deal with Caesar and the Roman authorities. He deals with the religious leaders. So the question we have to wrestle with is this. What happens when the problem isn't Rome, but instead is religion? What does Jesus do? So for us, we'd say it this way. What happens when the problem isn't the state, but instead is the church? What if the problem isn't the Democrats or the Republicans? What if the problem in our world, the problems in our world isn't social media or talk news? What if it's not the school board? What if it's not the public school system? What if the problem is the church? So I wonder if Jesus were to descend upon our community, I don't think he's going to the McDonough Square. I think he's stopping by a few churches first. I think he's coming to our house. I think he's got some questions for us. I don't think he's flipping over tables at the courthouse or in the mayor's office. I think he's flipping over tables in churches. Because that's what's happening here. I know we want to blame everything on everybody else. But when Jesus makes his grand entrance to finally overthrow the oppressor isn't Rome. The oppressor is the temple. Do you see it? So what do we do? What happens? He comes into Jerusalem to make all things right. The expectation is save us from the evil Romans, save us from them. He sets up an elaborate entrance meant to garner attention. All eyes are on him, and he goes straight to the temple. If Rome's the problem, then why make a spectacle of the religious leaders? But the truth is, not much has changed for us in 2023. Jesus goes after those taking advantage of the poor, those making money off of those who needed pigeons. The fastest growing churches in America today is the prosperity gospel kind of churches, word of faith kinds of churches. And their whole creed is that you will be healthy and wealthy. If you plant a seed to the Lord, he will bless you 100,000-fold. And you know who needs a blessing 100 and 1,000-fold? The poor. So they set up their churches in impoverished communities that they might grow their numbers, grow their building, grow their wardrobes, while taking advantage of the poor. It's not just them. Churches in America are leaving neighborhoods and communities because those communities have changed. They're no longer the rural subdivisions they used to be. Now they've become the inner city or the ghetto. And so the churches are leaving the people they've been called to reach. Why? Because just like them, just like the temple, it was meant to be a place where God, where the heaven and earth meet, but instead has become a place where man elevates himself over others. Christians now are taking advantage of the church for personal, business, networking reasons. It's personal and financial gain. It's whatever. In the South, again, you put a Jesus fish on your plumbing van, you're going to get some business. That's not the way of Jesus. Many of us grew up in churches where we were taught morality and religion, and we were never taught the way of Jesus. It's keeping us from actually seeing him. The Pharisees, the scribes, the religious leaders, they can't see Jesus right in front of them. So what do we do? Right? Like how do we, it's not gone away, is my point. So what do we do? Well, back at the fig tree episode, which was brilliant by Jesus, wasn't it? You look like you're supposed to be feeding me, but all I see is leaves. You're lying. You're hypocritical. Look at verse 20 of chapter 21. When the disciples saw Jesus make the tree wither, they marveled, saying, "How did that happen all at once?" And Jesus said to them, "Truly I say to you, if you have faith and don't doubt, you will not only do what has been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain," what mountain? The Temple Mount. What mountain is there? That's the mountain. You'll be able to say to the religious system, to those that are oppressing the poor and the vulnerable, you'll be able to say to them, be taken up and thrown into the sea. The sea is a Jewish euphemism for chaos. You'll be able to spin them into chaos. You really care about the way of Jesus, then let's tear down the systems that get in the way of it. Whatever you ask in prayer, you will receive if you have faith. So Jesus is calling out hypocrisy in the church. But if you're like me, you grew up with an understanding of hypocrisy. In the church, hypocrisy meant someone who says they're a Christian, but they dance and drink and smoke pot. That's what hypocrisy is. I want you to pay attention to the hypocrites here. We'll learn about it more in Matthew 23. The hypocrites biblically are the moral ones. You know who's the best at keeping the law? The scribes and the Pharisees and the elders. They're the kind of people you want your daughter to marry, you want your son to turn out to be. They're good conservative citizens. That's who we want them to be. So the hypocrisy is not that they claim to do one thing and then live lives that are different than that. The hypocrisy is that they fail to see Jesus for who he is. That's the hypocrisy. And their systems have gotten in the way of it. Jesus is being followed by tax collectors and sinners and prostitutes. So what is hypocrisy? Let's go back to the fig tree. Hypocrisy is when you look like you should have the fruit of the Spirit, but you actually don't. So hypocrisy, biblically, would not mean that you claim to be a Christian, but you get drunk on the weekends. Hypocrisy, according to the scriptures, is that you claim to be a Christian, but you yell at people on social media. Hypocrisy, biblically, would be that you claim to be a Christian and you are unkind to your neighbor. Hypocrisy, biblically, is that you claim to be a Christian and you gossip about your boss to fellow coworkers. See, the problem that we think is the problem is that we don't think we're as bad as other people. This is the religious leaders. The Bible is clear about what we are called to produce. When the Bible speaks of fruit, the Bible speaks in Galatians 5. Here's what the fruit is, the fruit of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against these things, there's no law. You can have as much of that as you want. So how are we doing? The last day of 2023, are you more loving today than you were on January 1st of 2023? Are you more joyful? Are you more at peace? Do you bring more peace? Are you more patient and kind? Are you more good and faithful and gentle? How's your self-control? You still reactionary? So what does it mean to bear fruit? This is what it means. John 15, we learned that we bear fruit by being with Jesus. So religion, the state, law, they can create morality, but they cannot develop the fruit of the Spirit. And many of us have defaulted to that. But how do we know that we are who we claim to be? So we love our neighbor well. It's almost like Jesus should have said that as one of the commandments. There's joy in our lives. There's peace. Wherever we go, peace follows us. We're patient with people, kind and good. We're generous. We have self-control. That's what it means. That's what Jesus is looking for. So Jesus travels by donkey to your house. What tables is he flipping over? In your heart, where are we taking advantage of people? Where are we leveraging our authority to get what we want from people? Where are we being dishonest about who we are? Where are we trying to enter the wedding feast without putting on the righteousness and the finished work of Jesus? That's what's happening in Jerusalem. And he's not showing up at your boss's house or the principal's house or the school board's house. He's not going to the mayor. He's not going to the White House. He's coming to us. I just wonder how we're doing. Would you bow your heads and close your eyes as we wrap up this morning? I just want us to take stock of it. Where are we today? In regards to fruit, where are we? Has Jesus come to us looking for fruit when all he's found is leaves? Maybe you talk a good game. Maybe you've grown in religion, but you haven't borne any fruit. And maybe it's not a question you can answer. Maybe you have to ask your spouse or your kids, your mom or your dad. Here's the good news of Jesus coming to Jerusalem. For those of us who still need pigeons, he fights for us. He's not going to let the religious institution take advantage of you. But the requirement is the same. You don't get in because you need a pigeon. You get in because you're covered in the righteousness of Jesus. So that's the invitation today, is to follow him. Take what he has to give, not depend upon your own righteousness, but instead his. Father, you know our hearts. You know those of us who are filled right now with godly repentance, that we see it, and we don't want to continue to live that way. We don't like those things about us. We've become people who blame shift like Adam did, and you're calling us now to examine our own hearts, to check us. And maybe before we step into a new year, that we would examine it now, that we don't carry it forward. And I'm thankful there's grace upon grace for us who would confess and repent. Would that be a mark of our lives over the next year? For those of us who have been hurt by the money changers and the institution, would you lift our eyes to you? Hoshana, save us, Son of David. You're all we want. You're all we need. You are salvation. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.